General Frost killed more German soldiers than the Red Army. Think about that for a moment. An enemy with no flag, no face, and no mercy. You are on the Eastern Front. It is 40 degrees below zero. The wind doesn't just bite, it tears away your body heat in layers. You are one of millions, but you have never felt so alone. This wasn't a new story. History just keeps forgetting the lesson. In 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte marched into Russia with the largest European army ever assembled. Over 400,000 frontline soldiers. He was the master of the battlefield. But he was about to meet a greater power. Fewer than 40,000 of his main army would ever make it back. The official reports blamed disease and starvation. They don't tell you the full story. They don't describe the sound of a man's breathing freezing solid in his throat. They don't mention that the horses, stripped of their horseshoes for grip on the ice, simply froze to death standing up. The real enemy was the cold. It is a silent, methodical killer. First, your body begins to shiver uncontrollably. This is your last, desperate attempt to generate heat. Then comes the confusion. Hypothermia sets in. It mimics drunkenness. You might feel a sudden, paradoxical wave of warmth, causing you to shed the very clothes that could save you. Your body is making a choice, a brutal, biological triage. It sacrifices your fingers, your toes, your limbs, to keep your heart and brain alive for just a few minutes longer. The German High Command in World War II made the exact same mistake as Napoleon. They planned for a short war. They expected victory by autumn. Their soldiers wore standard wool greatcoats, completely inadequate for the Russian winter. Their standard rifle oil, Ballistol, turned to gel. The bolt on the Kar 98K rifle would freeze solid, turning a precision weapon into a useless iron club. Now, imagine you are that soldier. Your weapon is frozen. Your food is frozen. The very air you breathe feels like swallowing needles. And the enemy you face isn't just in the trench opposite you. It's everywhere. It's inside your boots, inside your lungs. It never sleeps. For centuries, commanders saw winter as an unbeatable foe, an act of God, a force of nature to be endured. But what if one army didn't just endure it? What if they turned the killer into an ally and weaponized the cold itself? Faced the German invasion with a brutal understanding of its own geography. They knew the cold was an ally. They had seen it defeat Napoleon. Joseph Stalin, the Soviet leader, famously declared, "The winter general will fight for us." This wasn't just bravado. It was a strategy. You see, while German soldiers froze, the Soviets had prepared. Their standard uniform included padded jackets called telogrekas and felt boots known as valenki. These were specifically designed for extreme cold. Think about the difference this made. One army was simply trying to survive. The other was equipped to fight. This level of foresight is often overlooked in historical accounts. The official records focus on tank battles and troop movements, but they rarely describe the warmth of a felt boot. Here's where the story takes a turn. The Soviets didn't just equip their soldiers better. They weaponized the land itself. In October 1941, as German forces advanced on Moscow, a desperate order was issued: scorched earth. Every railway, every bridge, every supply depot in the path of the Germans was to be destroyed. This wasn't just burning fields. This was a systematic obliteration of infrastructure. General Franz Halder, chief of the German Army General Staff, recorded in his war diary on November 13, 1941, the devastating impact of this policy. He noted, "The destruction of roads, railways, bridges, and towns is proceeding according to plan." Imagine the scale of this. Entire villages vanished. Factories were dismantled and moved eastward, sometimes hundreds of kilometers away. This wasn't merely a tactic. It was a total war against the enemy's logistics. They denied the Germans shelter. They denied them food. They denied them any chance of living off the land. And here's the part nobody talks about enough. The Soviet partisans played a critical role in this strategy. These were not regular army units. They were civilians, often farmers, who stayed behind enemy lines. Their mission was simple: harass the Germans, sabotage their supply lines, and enforce the scorched earth policy. In the forests surrounding Smolensk, partisan groups, some numbering only a few dozen, tied down entire German battalions. They used the terrain, the deep snow, and their intimate knowledge of the local area to their advantage. You might think a few dozen civilians couldn't make a difference against a modern army. But they didn't need to win head-on battles. They just needed to inflict constant damage. They cut telegraph lines. They derailed trains carrying vital supplies. They spread disinformation. Their actions were small, but relentless. The German High Command struggled to understand this new kind of warfare. They were used to clear front lines and conventional engagements. This was different. This was an enemy that melted back into the frozen landscape. General Heinz Guderian, a prominent German tank commander, wrote in his memoirs about the unrelenting activity of the partisans in the winter of 1941 to 1942. He described it as a second front behind their lines. This wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a drain on resources. Every derailed train meant less fuel, less ammunition, less food for the frontline troops who were already battling the cold. You are a German soldier, freezing in a trench. Your rations are dwindling. Your commander tells you supplies are delayed. You hear whispers of trains being blown up in the night. What do you think that does to morale? It erodes it. It plants doubt. It creates an invisible enemy that could strike anywhere, anytime. The official German reports focused on the lack of proper winter gear. They detailed the frostbite casualties, the frozen engines, but they often understated the psychological toll. The constant threat of sabotage, the feeling of being surrounded, the knowledge that even the very air was against them. This was a war of attrition, and the Soviets understood that the cold, combined with partisan action, could break the enemy's will. General Georgy Zhukov, one of the most successful Soviet commanders, later stated that the scorched earth policy and partisan warfare were decisive factors in halting the German advance on Moscow. It was a brutal strategy, yes. It caused immense suffering for the civilian population. But it achieved its objective. It turned the vast frozen expanse of Russia into a deadly trap. But how did the Soviets coordinate these disparate partisan groups? How did they maintain communication and supply them deep behind enemy lines, in a landscape deliberately stripped bare? Behind enemy lines in 1941 seems impossible. How do you direct a ghost army in a land deliberately burned to ash? The answer lay not in advanced technology, but in simple, brutal ingenuity. You might think that with all the destruction, the Soviets simply lost control. But that's not what happened. They had a system, a network of dedicated operatives, often women, who moved through the forests and villages. These were not soldiers with radios. These were couriers, carrying messages by hand, often memorized. They faced incredible dangers. German patrols were everywhere. The penalty for being caught was immediate execution. And here's where it gets truly unsettling. The official German records from late 1941 rarely mention these couriers. They focused on larger partisan groups. It's almost as if they couldn't comprehend the existence of such a low-tech, high-impact network. Think about the courage that required. Walking alone through deep snow, knowing every step could be your last. These were not professional spies. They were ordinary people. But what drove them to such extraordinary acts? It was a fight for survival, yes, but it was also a deep connection to the land itself. The forests of Russia, vast and unforgiving, became their sanctuary and their weapon. The partisans did not just hide in the woods. They lived there. They knew every trail, every frozen stream, every hidden clearing. German soldiers, trained for open warfare, were lost the moment they stepped off the main roads. General Erhard Raus, a German panzer commander, wrote in his memoirs about the impenetrable forests and the fanatical resistance they encountered. He noted that even with superior firepower, they struggled to pin down an enemy that simply melted away. This wasn't a fair fight. It was a brutal game of hide-and-seek, but the stakes were life and death. The Soviets, even as they retreated, established hidden supply caches. Weapons, ammunition, medical supplies, even propaganda leaflets. These were buried deep in the forests, marked by secret signs known only to the partisans. You have to ask yourself, how did they manage this under constant German air superiority? The answer is simple. At night. Under the cover of darkness, small aircraft, often biplanes, would fly low, dropping containers. Sometimes the planes couldn't land. The supplies would be parachuted in. This was a dangerous, often inaccurate process. Many containers were lost, but enough got through, enough to keep the partisan war burning. And here's the twist. The German intelligence services knew about these drops. Their aerial reconnaissance spotted the telltale signs, but they couldn't stop them all. The scale of the Soviet territory was simply too vast. They were playing whack-a-mole on a continental scale. They could destroy one cache, but another would spring up 100 kilometers away. It was a war of attrition, not just of men, but of resources and will. The most chilling aspect of this hidden war was the psychological impact. German soldiers, already battling the cold, were now fighting an enemy they often couldn't see. An enemy that seemed to emerge from the very trees. An enemy that knew their movements before they made them. What do you think that does to a soldier's mind? It creates paranoia. It erodes trust. It makes every shadow a potential threat. General Heinz Guderian, despite his focus on tank warfare, recognized this. He described the partisan operations as a heavy burden on German morale. It was a constant drain, a bleeding wound that never healed. The official German reports focused on the lack of proper winter gear. They detailed the frostbite casualties, the frozen engines, but they often understated the psychological toll. The constant threat of sabotage, the feeling of being surrounded, the knowledge that even the very air was against them. This was a war of attrition, and the Soviets understood that the cold, combined with partisan action, could break the enemy's will. General Georgy Zhukov, one of the most successful Soviet commanders, later stated that the scorched earth policy and partisan warfare were decisive factors in halting the German advance on Moscow. The German High Command, fixated on conventional battlefields, failed to grasp the true nature of this invisible enemy. They saw trees. The Soviets saw cover. They saw snow. The Soviets saw an ally. They saw civilians. The Soviets saw soldiers. The true genius of the Soviet strategy wasn't just surviving winter. It was turning the entire landscape and its people into a weapon. A weapon that bled the German war machinery relentlessly. But what if the greatest deception wasn't in the forests, but in the very heart of German intelligence itself? It wasn't just the forests that became a weapon, but the very people inhabiting them. The German intelligence services, despite their vast resources, consistently underestimated the human element. They saw numbers. They saw territory. They failed to see the individual stories. And here's the part nobody talks about enough: the cost. The unimaginable human cost of this scorched earth strategy. You might imagine the partisans as hardened soldiers, but many were just ordinary people. Take, for instance, Anya Petrova, a schoolteacher from a small village near Smolensk. Her diary entries, recovered decades later, speak not of heroism, but of fear, of cold, of hunger. She wrote on December 12, 1941, "The children shiver even by the fire. We have burned everything. The Germans will find nothing but ash." This was not a strategic advantage to her. It was a daily, brutal reality. She was one of thousands forced to make impossible choices. The official Soviet narratives often glorified partisan actions, But they rarely detailed the suffering, the constant threat of reprisal. For every German train derailed, a village might be burned in retaliation. The civilian population paid a heavy price. Families were torn apart, homes destroyed, and yet they persisted. Why? Because the alternative was worse. They knew what German occupation meant. It meant starvation, it meant forced labor, it meant mass executions. The choice for many was not between fighting and not fighting. It was between two different forms of death, and they chose to fight. Think about the psychological burden of that decision: to destroy your own home, to burn your own fields, to deny the enemy shelter even if it meant denying it to yourself. This isn't just strategy, it's a profound act of defiance. The German High Command struggled to comprehend this level of resistance. They labeled partisans as bandits and terrorists. General Erich von Manstein, a highly regarded German field marshal, in his memoirs expressed bewilderment at the fanatical determination of the civilian population. He couldn't reconcile it with his understanding of warfare. He couldn't grasp that sometimes the fight isn't for territory, but for survival itself. What do you think that does to a soldier? To fight an enemy that isn't just uniformed, but is the very ground you stand on. It creates a deep, unsettling fear. It makes every civilian a potential threat, every shadow a hiding place. The German counter-partisan operations were brutal. Entire villages were razed. Tens of thousands of civilians were executed. This was a war without rules, fought in the frozen wilderness. And the official reports, the ones you read in history books, often gloss over these atrocities. They focus on the grand battles, the movements of armies. They omit the personal stories, the screams in the night, the silent desperation of a mother trying to feed her children in a landscape deliberately turned barren. The true scale of civilian involvement and suffering is often buried beneath layers of military history. It's almost as if acknowledging it would complicate the clean narratives of victory and defeat. You see, the hidden enemy wasn't just the cold or the partisan. It was the resilience of ordinary people pushed to their absolute limits. It was the human spirit, weaponized by desperation. And that, you realize, is perhaps the most terrifying force of all. What becomes of it when the guns finally fall silent? You might think the story ends with the victory parades, with Re. But it's never that simple. The war ends. The fight does not. The hidden enemy simply changes its form. Here is the part the official histories conveniently omit. The psychological cost for the victors was immense. In the decades following 1945, Soviet medical archives logged countless cases of what they termed partisan syndrome. It wasn't just post-traumatic stress. It was a profound, lingering unease, a moral injury. Think about what that truly means.